Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 47. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. You can always access our podcast and other information at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Mark Clifford, President and Board Member of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Previously, he was director of Next Digital, the publisher of the pro-democracy Apple Daily newspaper, executive director of the Hong Kong-based Asia Business Council, editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post, a publisher and editor-in-chief of The Standard. He held senior editorial positions at Business Week and Far Eastern Economic Review in Hong Kong and Seoul, and has received numerous prizes and awards for his books and journalism. One of his books, published in 2022 by St. Martin's, Today, Hong Kong, Tomorrow, the World, What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere. With that, Mark, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Well, it's our pleasure. And as I forewarned in our pre-show, we'd like to help our audience get to know a little bit about our guests. And my favorite topic to get that kicked off is, when you were in grade school and that's what you wanted to grow up and do, was it, hey, I'd like to lead a pro-Hong Kong foundation in the United States?
I'm an accidental activist. I had never intended to do this, and it's something that came up. Actually, it was on my 64th birthday 3 years ago that I took over as president of what became the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Because of my experiences in Hong Kong, my 28 years there, and the fact that 7 of my colleagues from Apple Daily had been thrown in jail just for practicing journalism. And I was so outraged, naively outraged, I think, about how easy it might be to get some results. I should have known better in dealing with Beijing. That, along with a group of friends and others who had close ties to Hong Kong, many of whom knew Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, we just decided we needed to do what we could to get these people out of jail. And unfortunately, things have gone from bad to worse, and we've now got 1,800, that's 1,800 political prisoners and counting in Hong Kong jails. So, in elementary school, I was always interested in politics. One of my earliest memories is of the Berlin Wall going up at a very, very young age for me. I lived in Berlin for a while in 1980-81 at a time when it seemed the wall would be with us forever. And I was overjoyed, and one of the great memories of my life is I was in Asia, I was in Korea, but of seeing that wall come down. So nothing lasts forever, even totalitarianism.
Now, what took you to Asia to begin with? You obviously spent a lot of your life there, but was it just an obvious progression? It was one of those things that's Forrest Gump feather accidental, like blew you in that direction.
I think it was a feather that blew me in that direction. I'd spent a fair amount of time in Europe just traveling, studying languages. I studied history at UC Berkeley, and I studied actually the English Industrial Revolution. And then I was lucky enough to be given a fellowship at Columbia University in New York City, of course, for journalists who specialize in business and economic journalism. And given my background in history and in industrial development, it seemed like Asia was the place to be. Honestly, when I went to Korea in 1987, I thought I was too late. I thought I'd already missed Asia's industrial revolution because,
of course, were mature by then.
Japan had been growing for decades, and the 4 little dragons, or there were 4 tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, of course, had supercharged growth of a sort that the world had never seen. So I wanted to live abroad. I was a business and economic journalist, and taking that, I'd been at Forbes and left that job to do the Columbia Fellowship. And so a feather blew me in that direction. But honestly, if somebody had offered me a similar job, I went to the Far Eastern Economic Review. If somebody had offered me a job in an equivalent publication in Africa, I would have taken that. I was very, very, very lucky to end up in Asia at a time when In fact, the growth was just starting. And I remember at Columbia doing some work on the Chinese economy, which was just not even a decade into the reform period. And everybody had an idea, and you could do the math on paper. If China grows, the way these other Asian countries does at 6 or 8% a year, gee, it could get pretty big pretty fast. But none of us, nobody, not the most bullish people out there, saw what was going to happen in the next 3 or 4 decades. And in many ways, it's one of the great success stories of human history. And we've seen 800 million or so people pulled out of grinding absolute poverty. And we've seen, economically and in many ways socially, China be an enormous success of a sort that the world couldn't imagine and in many ways should celebrate. And that was the beginning of the story. Obviously, it's not where we are now.
Yeah, well, you've plugged in at the Asian experience at roughly the same time I did. I was sent as a missionary in 1987 to Taiwan and sort of went from there in a few different directions. And what a different time and set of circumstances and assumptions. The Cold War still going. Martial law was just barely ending in Taiwan. Hong Kong, very different place in the waning days of the colonial experience, but the joint declaration about to be reached, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, part of our Hong Kong conversation really picks up right around that pivotal time when you're getting into the region. Frankly, your bio just takes me down memory lane of the periodicals that we were forced to read and follow at the time. And there wasn't an internet. We actually had hard copies of Far Eastern Economic Review and the South China Morning Post and things like that. These were almost canonical texts for us to track what was going on in the broader region. It's a little different now, but maybe share a little bit about what were sort of your key takeaways of journalism in Asia in the late 80s going into the early 90s, and kind of how that compared and contrasted before we really get to the downward fall in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, Steve, it's fantastic. I didn't know that you went to Taiwan in '87. So I went to Korea in June '87, and you'll remember martial law in Taiwan was lifted in July that year. Korea started down its path of democracy when the government agreed in the face of huge popular protests to allow for democratic elections. And so we were lucky enough to witness places that were building on their economic success and a social kind of development to then go in a direction of much greater democratic political openness. And I think that probably skewed my thinking and made me more optimistic about what would happen in China. But to go back to your question about information, I mean, we forget not only there was barely email. I mean, phone calls were $3 a minute to the U.S. I mean, communications were more by aerogram than well, not by internet. And so we did have magazines like the Far Eastern Economic Review, which had the temerity to cover everything from Pakistan to Japan. And you had people like me, foreigners, who presumed to be writing about a country because local journalists, for the most part, couldn't do that. They'd be thrown in jail. I had a very brave Korean colleague, Shim Jae-hoon, who actually had to leave the country for much of the 1980s because of his involvement with good coverage of the Gwangju killings, so the kind of Tiananmen of Korea in the early 1980s. So it was really tough for journalists. There wasn't information. There was censorship. So the few Koreans who...
that was among our friends.
Yeah, right. The few Koreans who got the Far Eastern Economic Review or the Asian Wall Street Journal got it a day or two late and might have pages missing or articles cut out. So, it's almost unimaginable to think of kind of how sheltered and cosseted we were, and then or how siloed and what a scarce commodity information was. But that actually takes us to the events of June 4th, 1989, when we listened to shortwave radio and heard the stories of the massacre unfolding in Beijing. And in Hong Kong at that time, hundreds of thousands of people had been marching in the streets in support of the protesters in Tiananmen. And among them was a young garment industry executive named Jimmy Lai. And he looked at the events of Tiananmen and he realized that an upstart network named CNN was there, and that along with other broadcast networks, they were able to cover events almost in real time. So in the past, if something bad had happened, as it did in Taiwan or Korea, where there were killings, nobody would know about it, or a little information would trickle out. There certainly weren't real-time images. And so that, interestingly, that revolution in media is what prompted Jimmy Lai to say, I'm getting out of garments, I'm getting out of the retail business, and I'm going into media, because media is information. Information is going to be a commodity. There's going to be more of it, but it's also transparency, and it's going to sweep away corruption. It's going to sweep away totalitarianism. I'm going to start a magazine, and I'm going to help Hong Kong, and I'm also going to help China in their process of economic reform and ultimately of political reform.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there, and I think really spilling out of that meridian in time with Tiananmen and all the things that happened around that time. I mean, really from that point forward, there was an enormous acceleration in information industry. We not long after have email by way of things like Prodigy, AOL, CompuServe, and things that my kids don't even know about. But it was the beginning of this weird new thing called email. But there was also just an explosion of different kinds of publications. Asian press got so free, it got a little bit crazy, maybe fast and loose with the truth every once in a while, some might have said. But some of those really interesting and active markets like Taiwan and Korea, Hong Kong was right dead center in that, and was very much a window into China in ways that Taiwan couldn't. And really, I mean, Korea maintained diplomatic relations with Taiwan up into the early 90s. And so Seoul was not a position from which to have a window into China. Taiwan was not post to have a window into China the same way. Hong Kong really was. So there's that part of it, just the media industry. But before we get to that, there was another foot in Jimmy's back in terms of making his change in careers. And this is one of the things that I think the audience knows, but it just can't get emphasized enough. When you know a human being who's taken something from $0 to $1 billion once, that's amazing. Twice, it's borderline miraculous. And it was that time. And this is another part of Jimmy that I found to be just extraordinary and often not appreciated in international coverage. He's talked about as this harsh critic of China. But as you know, I mean, he could easily be brought to tears talking about kind of a deep love of the China of his family, of his mind, of his memory. And it was out of empathy for wanting something better for all Chinese people. And I think this just doesn't come across enough. But he took risks. He provided aid and comfort and material to those demonstrators. And the people who were in the factories working to supply the garments that were a part of the Giordano brand, their jobs became at risk because of political pressure in response to Jimmy's help. And he made a gut-wrenching decision about walking away from something he had built, but it was, at least as I've come to understand it, correct me if I'm missing something important, he did it out of care for those workers, not wanting them to lose their jobs and opportunity because of the stand he took. But that just was a window into the humanity of the guy that we're going to talk about a couple of times through this. But that meridian in time of 1989 just can't be emphasized enough. But there's a couple of other meridians in time for the Hong Kong experience. And I'll just ask you, since you were there through a lot of this, talk about some of that winding down of the British Empire, the approach towards the handover, the transition of sovereignty to the People's Republic of China, kind of what kind of the thought processes, the expectations, the mood was going in. Because looking back from today, seems like an obvious bad deal. And some people thought it was then. But I don't know, my part of living through it, there was a lot more optimism that the PRC might be changing. There was optimism about the power of information, the internet, and other kinds of things. And there was optimism about international assurances. But rather than me putting words in your mouth, you were there, witness to history. Help fill in some of that buildup.
Yeah, no, I think you've pegged it, Steve. I mean, it was a kind of a manic depressive mood. One day you'd wake up feeling fantastic. Everything looked like it was going in the right direction. China wanted to get into the Beijing Olympics. It wanted to host the Beijing Olympics. It wanted to get into the WTO. It wanted to be taken seriously as a negotiating partner with the U.S., with the EU, and they were on really good behavior. They'd made all these promises, and Mao was fading into the past. He died in the mid 1970s, so it was 2 decades since then. We were 15, almost 20 years into the economic reform process, and people like Jimmy. I've just finishing a biography of him that will be published later on this year, and talked to somebody who knew him back in the 1970s and 1980s when he was a garment guy. And Jimmy Lai, he said he was almost like a Zionist. He was so pro-China. I mean, he just believed in China. He loved it. He really thought Deng Xiaoping and economic reform were going to change China, or they're going to make it rich and make it modern. And by modern, he meant things like rule of law and openness and transparency, not having to worry about the knock on your door at midnight. And yet, the night of the handover, actually, in the course of doing the research for this biography, I talked to a friend who was with him that night, and he was gloomy. The rest of the city was partying, fireworks were going off, and he had a small gathering at his house, and everybody was trying to be happy, and he was sitting there morose. And I remember seeing him crying on stage in front of 500 people a few weeks earlier, saying he thought he was going to go to jail. And this was 1997. I remember thinking, boy, I'd known Jimmy for 4 years or so then. He's always a pretty emotional guy, often prone to tears. But I thought, isn't he getting a little too worked up? I mean, do we really have to? Would the Chinese throw Jimmy Lai in jail? And there from time to time there'd be rumors. There's some secret list of people they're going to round up. Well, that list may or may not have existed, but most of those people who were on that putative list have been rounded up. And so, but I think we go back to that time. Look, when things like this happen, most of us as humans are more or less hardwired for optimism, for figuring we'll work things out somehow. And we wanted to believe, right? And of course, wanting to believe, hope is not a strategy. And yet we had more than just hope. We had promises, solemn UN registered treaty that the Chinese had signed with Britain. We had the basic law where China promised the people of Hong Kong all the rights and freedoms that they had under the British colonial period and more. We'd have a path to universal suffrage so we could elect our mayor and our city council, which is really all that it was about. Free speech, all these promises. And it looked like the economy was growing so fast. Everything was, more and more free in the mainland. Okay, there was Tiananmen in 1989, hard to forget that, but sort of gets buried as history goes on. So very, very mixed feelings, Steve. And as I say, kind of manic depressive. One day you'd wake up feeling good. The next day you'd wake up thinking about those PLA troops, jackbooting their way in, which they did.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were some signals that people would reasonably look to, like the annual vigil for the June 4th massacre, where not small numbers of Hong Kongers would gather publicly. Clearly something that Beijing wanted to memory hold completely for the Chinese population, and yet it was permitted in Hong Kong without really any interference that was detectable. And it seemed like they were going to just let Hong Kong be Hong Kong and just try to keep it from spilling over across the boundary into the other system. So the one country, two systems, for a time, there was some behavior you could see as evidence of this construct in action. And yet, fast forward a little bit, we get to some tests. We have something called Article 23 that pops up. That's not going to matter to a lot of people in the audience. If they think of the number 23, they might think of like a Michael Jordan jersey, or they're not going to know what is this. But maybe talk a little bit about the arc of kind of the encroachment of the Communist Party wanting its side of things to get defined and have some control, and the youthful and broader popular resistance as it built up, because there was a lot of this for years that happened before we got to the penultimate massive demonstrations and big crackdown.
Yeah. Well, Article 23 was refers to the Article 23 in the Basic Law, the mini constitution that governs Hong Kong that I alluded to a few minutes ago. And that said that Hong Kong should, on its own, legislate against national security offenses. In other words, the Hong Kong legislature, the city council, should come up with a bill that would protect the city against national security threats. That's reasonable. Most societies have national security laws, but critics rightly saw that as a wedge by which Beijing would try to insert more punitive legislation that would eventually result in a crackdown on freedoms. For the first 7 years or so, 6 years or so, there was no move to enact the Article 23 legislation because I think the government quite rightly realized it would be like a third rail of politics. And in late 2002, Regina Ip, the Secretary for Security, introduced the legislation, and there were a couple of dozen people or so protesting at first. I think they burned it and, had a little bonfire to burn the legislation. I believe that was October, so autumn of 2022. Slowly opposition mounted. And at the forefront of the opposition was the newspaper founded by Jimmy Lai, Apple Daily, and his magazine, Next Magazine. Now, there were others. I mean, the pro-democracy crowd was obviously against this. But in the end, 500,000 people out of a city of 7.5 million people, 500,000 people came out on a sweltering July 1st, coincidentally the anniversary of the handover to China. It was the 6th anniversary of the handover. So this was almost unprecedented. During the Tiananmen support demonstrations, once there have been 500,000 people out. But think about it. 500,000 people in a city of 7 million people, and there weren't people coming from across the border. I mean, they just weren't. So enormous outpouring of popular discontent. And it was not just against Article 23, it was against corruption, misgovernance, a whole range of issues. And I think Apple Daily was kind of pegged from that moment. It had always agitated for democracy. It had always, Jimmy Lai had been very outspoken in calling for democracy. But when the communist authorities saw that Apple and Next, led by Jimmy Lai, could pull 500,000 people out in the streets, that's the kind of thing that strikes panic into totalitarian rulers, into communist Leninist rulers. And I think it went back earlier to some things that Jimmy had written, but that was a key turning point in 2003. And from that point on, Jimmy and Apple and Next were kind of in the absence of a real opposition political system, they were the opposition political party. They could pull people out in the streets. They could mobilize society against the communist rulers. And that struck terror into the hearts of the leaders in Beijing.
Yeah. And yet through this well over a decade and a half from those initial protests, and there would be other protests that would be umbrella and other kinds of things, through it all, Apple Daily was publishing away relatively uninhibited and could report on scandals in government, challenge officials, occasionally insult the big poobahs in Beijing. But really, Hong Kong remained a place where journalism was pretty free and protected. And that part of one country, two systems seemed to be holding up until it didn't. So let's pivot a little bit, because I want to try to zoom out some out of just journalism and kind of what was happening in Hong Kong with the people we know and like in that industry. But the U.S. government had some interest in what happened with the Hong Kong handover. Hong Kong was talked about in the context of China's most favored nation status debates in the 1990s. When it became permanent, there was a Hong Kong Policy Act that came into play that led to some annual reporting. There was pretty consistent congressional interest in Hong Kong, especially over, say, the first 10 years after the handover. I'd say after that, well, I'm sure there were some well-meaning, committed folks. It really seemed to fade a little bit back into the broader woodwork. So we get to this period where it's getting to be crunch time, and this is we're dealing with recent years. We had a policy of the United States that said, we're going to watch this, we're going to report about this, we're going to emphasize one country, two systems, and the promises of the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration. But there wasn't a lot of teeth to that policy. Basically, if we didn't like what we saw, the basic threat was, well, we're just going to call it one country, one system. And for a lot of that history, many of us thought, well, that's just a punishment to the people of Hong Kong. So talk a little bit about what your perceptions were of what U.S. policy was and how what impact the U.S. government was really having. Because this was, in some ways, a British narrative, and the American part was a little bit different in Hong Kong than, say, Korea, Taiwan, and other parts of Asia.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think benign neglect, I think, which is more or less what you're describing, and pretty much sums it up. Look, the Hong Kong people were promised democracy. They were told that in 2007, 10 years after the handover, that there'd be, fully free elections, at least for the city council. And 2007 came and went, and the can kept getting kicked down the road by one Chinese official after another, depending on who was in power. And but for the U.S., it's like, okay, you're not getting democracy, but it's not going backwards. The one country, two systems, sort of going back a little earlier in the conversation that China had promised, was more or less intact. I mean, the Chinese officials I spoke to, Hong Kong officials I spoke to, and I ran both the English language newspapers there. That really did seem to be the reality. One of the worst legacies the British left was an inability to train a political class. So you had top-notch administrators, your number two, your senior government officials. They could match with almost anybody in the world, bearing in mind it's a small place. But they didn't develop political leaders. And so they didn't have people who could stand up to Beijing the way a provincial governor or even a mayor of a large city could in China. And so Hong Kong's leaders didn't know how to fight for the people of Hong Kong. And so they got squeezed, I think, and I'm not trying to shed any tears for them because they didn't stand up, but the students in a younger generation, I mean, much to China's surprise, you had people who were born around the time of the handover who didn't remember British colonialism and how, quote unquote, bad it was and oppressive. They just knew that China had promised them democracy. These were international citizens, people who travel around the world, who eat at the best restaurants, go to the best museums, see what politics looks like in a New York or a London or even a Bangkok or a Seoul. And they didn't like these excuses anymore. And so you had the inability and the weakness, the fecklessness really of the Hong Kong leadership, coupled with the increasing demands of a younger generation, really kind of pushed things. They would have been pushed to a head anyway, but enter the Deus Ex Machina in the form of Xi Jinping, who's the toughest leader, at least since Mao, and you've really got to make the recipe for a tragedy, really.
Well, that's the pivot into the meat of what brings us together, because I completely agree that while the Communist Party of China was never populated by angels, Xi Jinping is different from those that came before. He may not be the only one, but certainly execution of policy under Xi Jinping is pronouncedly different than it was in previous eras. And it really affected Hong Kong in ways that I think per capita, much more significant than in other areas of their sphere of influence. And that's where, in my mind, one country, two systems went to one country, one system very quickly because Xi and his leadership made it so. Now, for people who are trying to watch this from the outside, what do you see as kind of changing? I mean, really, this was over somewhat of national security law claims that there would be kind of polluting kinds of activities going on in Hong Kong that would be advocating either independence or westernization of Hong Kong, that but also might be bringing in toxic notions and ties into broader China by way of Hong Kong. But what do you see as kind of the main drivers of why this shift from almost autopilot, one country, two systems, even with massive demonstrations from time to time, into something profoundly different, ending up with many, many political prisoners, including our good friends who are known around the world?
Yeah, well, I think we forget that Xi Jinping actually took a very close interest in Hong Kong, starting at least 3 or 4 years before he took power. He headed one of these small circle leading groups on Hong Kong, starting I think 2008 or 2009. He was very familiar with what was going on in Hong Kong. I think fundamentally, though, because the Chinese communists lie to each other, they lied to themselves about the people of Hong Kong. They've always gotten bad intelligence. This goes back at least to the early 1980s, with their claptrap about, British colonial oppression. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything about British colonial rule. There were a lot of things that were not nice about it, but the people of Hong Kong were not about to rise up against their colonial masters in hopes of inviting their red friends from the north. I mean, everybody in Hong Kong had left to escape the communist Chinese, or their parents or their grandparents had left. So, number one, the Chinese convinced themselves that the Hong Kongers were going to welcome themselves with open arms. The reason they promised free elections after 10 years is that they thought they could control, cajole, bribe, beat, bully, whatever it took to win elections. And when it became clear that 6 out of 10 Hong Kongers in every single election from 1991 until the last ones in 2019, 6 out of 10 people, give or take, always voted for the pro-democracy candidates. That's really hard for the Chinese communists to accept. And they because they all lie to themselves, and that's what they said, I really honestly think that they completely misunderstood Hong Kong. They talked to the business elite. They didn't talk to the people of Hong Kong, even though they had good grassroots organization. And Xi Jinping came in, sort of got involved about 10 years after the handover, at a time when it became clear that Hong Kong was not just going to go gently under Beijing's control. And there are two ways of dealing with that. In most open societies, if you got 500,000, let alone 2 million people out in the streets opposing you, you'd talk to the opposition. If you're in an authoritarian country, you crush the opposition. You don't even try to negotiate with them. In all this time, in the 27 years or whatever since the handover, 29 years now, I guess. Anyway, there's been one quasi-negotiation between student leaders and the government. There was just one thing in 2014 during the Umbrella Uprising. The
Right.
communist Chinese never wanted to engage with the people of Hong Kong and what they wanted. All the promises and all that were just to get deals done and treaties signed. They were very transactional. They weren't sincere. Again, enter Xi Jinping, and it's like, we could negotiate or we could crush. The decision was made to crush. The more they screwed down, the more the people resisted. And from about 2012, when you had students protesting against a proposal to have communist-style indoctrination in schools, through the umbrella movement of 2014, and then obviously the Summer of Democracy in 2019, you had increasing millions of Hong Kongers out on the street saying, we don't want this. But the Chinese Communist Party knows only one way to react to opposition, and that's to crush it.
Like so many important points in that, the most interesting, I think, is just this obvious fact that if we don't say it, people won't notice it. They didn't really want to talk to the people. They didn't really want to know the people. And so that leads me into sort of some of our conclusions that should be drawn from this experience. So if you're sitting in Taiwan, or you're sitting in the United States, or you're sitting in the Philippines these days, you look at the Hong Kong experience. What does it say about how can you negotiate with an entity like the CCP? What do agreements get you? If they don't respect the Chinese people, are they going to respect other people when it comes to these kinds of agreements or dealings? Sure seems to be a very, very cautionary tale. And of course, Taiwan was one of the leading targets of this proposition of one country, two systems. And it sure sends a chilling message if she was willing to cast that completely aside with Hong Kong. What options might he be considering for Taiwan? Now, I'm not trying to set you up to be a barge to tease apart all things Taiwan, but what are some of your key takeaways as you look at this part of your life and what you witnessed, and what reasonable people should take away from these machinations, international and domestic?
Well, I perhaps I could channel Ronald Reagan and say trust but verify. I'm not even sure I'd trust, but I definitely would verify.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we see that China will not keep to its international agreements except when it suits them. It says that it wants a rules-based order, international order, and yet when it lost a case regarding the South China Sea with the Philippines, it just ignored it, and it's militarized those islands. It's for years it said that every Chinese person wants reunification. Taiwanese on both or Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait want reunification. Well, that's obviously not true. What do? They just say, well, in that case, we're just going to take you. I mean, think about it. With Hong Kong, arguably at least, there was a treaty. Parts of Hong Kong the new territories would revert to China no matter what in 1997. So the British kind of had a real incentive to deal. Taiwan, the People's Republic of China, has never had sovereignty over the island of Taiwan. As a matter of fact, the Chinese state has only briefly and fitfully, over the last several thousand years of Chinese statecraft, had any kind of sovereignty over Taiwan. There is no way that China has the right to Taiwan. And the people of Taiwan have made it really clear they don't want that. So I think that there's no way that they should be trusting any promises that China makes. I think we've seen that deterrence has worked, and I hope will continue to work, but it's only going to work if it's backed up with sticks. And I think that's the more that we can help Taiwan arm and protect itself, the better off we're going to be. None of us want war, but I think the best way to prevent war is to be ready for it. And I think if a dictator says that he's going to do something and every action he takes suggests that he's getting ready to do that something, that very bad something in this case of seizing Taiwan, we have to take that person in that system very, very seriously indeed. It would be a disaster for all of us, for the whole globe, economically, socially, of course, lives lost. And we can't afford that. And the only thing that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party recognize is force.
Well, amen to that. And certainly very, very consistent with what the Hong Kong experience has been. So you would like to believe people at the very least would learn from the sad experience of others who gave a go with the international agreements. And yeah, it did go under People's Republic of China sovereignty. And so you can expect no better treatment than that. But my goodness. So let's focus a little bit now on the work that you're doing that is focused on Hong Kong. Tell us a little bit about the organization, the objectives, and how that is going.
Sure. Well, we were set up in the wake of the 2019 protests and above all the 2020 national security law that saw hundreds of people put into jail on national security charges, and more broadly a general crackdown on civil society, on media, on freedom. And we thought that it was wrong and just crazy and untenable that you could have a place that really was the most international cosmopolitan place in Asia, and one of the most in the world. Was a global financial center ranking with London and with New York, and yet they're putting people in jail just for being journalists or holding election primaries, for being politicians. I mean, the same kind of people we'd celebrate for civic involvement in a place like America or any open society. And so I mean, those, as I said, a small group of us who had some ties with Hong Kong just thought we needed to keep the world's attention on Hong Kong, because I think there's often it's a big world out there. It's crowded with crises, and it's easy to forget this little place of 7.5 million people. Particularly when atrocities like the genocidal behavior that the Chinese are displaying towards Uyghurs and the forced labor out in the Xinjiang region, the hundreds, if not thousands, of political prisoners being held in Chinese jails. It's easy to kind of forget because Hong Kong on the surface has its Michelin-starred restaurants and its nice hotels. But we want to remind people, when you go to those banking conferences and you're at the Four Seasons or the Conrad or the Shangri-La Hotel, that, literally just a couple hundred yards away, people are undergoing political trials. And these are the same people that you might have had dinner with a few years earlier. These are, sure, there are kids. There are people from 11 to 87 who have been arrested. There are over 10,000 people who were arrested on political charges since the 2019 events. Most of them, in fact, have not actually been formally charged or tried. So 3/4 of them, over 7,000, are sitting out there with their, in many cases, travel documents withheld. They can't travel. They've got charges hanging over their head. You've got 2,000 plus who have been convicted, and most of whom are serving time. And then you have these hundreds of people who've been pulled in under the national security law charges. So we count over 1,800 political prisoners in Hong Kong at this moment. Still keeps going up. I mean, they're slapping national security charges on people who are like scrawling graffiti on the back of a bus seat. Now, I don't think it's very nice to write on the back of a bus seat, but I'm not really sure you should be throwing people in jail under national security charges. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I mean, they're saying students aren't singing the national anthem loudly enough, or they're telling a special needs elementary school that needs to redouble its patriotic education. So we have offices, in terms of our work, we have offices in London and in Washington, D.C., and we think the road to change in Hong Kong is running through elected legislators in these two prominent places. Britain, of course, is the former colonial power. The U.S. as the most important exponent of freedom, I think, in international relations. I don't think we're naive about how quickly things are going to change. But I think the Chinese need to realize, and this policy is being driven from the top, from Beijing and from Xi Jinping. He needs to realize that if he wants help and he wants an easing of pressure for his economic and other problems, that a low-hanging fruit would be to ease off on Hong Kong, start letting people out of prison. We've got no illusions that Apple Daily is going to start publishing again, ever, or certainly not anytime soon. But let Jimmy lie. And there's Jimmy and the 6 other my colleagues at Apple Daily who've been held in jail for 3 years. Jimmy's in solitary confinement. I just heard they boarded up the window in his cell recently, just to add insult to injury for a 76-year-old diabetic. So they could ease off. I mean, Hong Kong is not a threat to China. Why Xi Jinping decided he needed to make an enemy of Hong Kong, I don't know, but that's where we are. And as long as these conditions exist in Hong Kong, we and others that we're working with are going to make it difficult and raise the cost for China. This is a cost they don't need to pay. It's low-hanging fruit in terms of them easing up on Hong Kong. And there's just no reason they need to be doing this.
Well, it is important, very, very important, that we get as big an audience as possible to understand that anyone who wants to move forward with whatever kind of negotiations with China, this needs to be in the mix to say, if you want to have anything approaching a normal commercial relationship with the People's Republic of China, then advocate for the release of political prisoners. You cannot advocate for free speech in the United States and not advocate for free people in Hong Kong. It doesn't mean that the Communist Party will move, but they ought to at least feel some friction about it. And after all, some people who had every option available to them to flee, but chose to stay and stand with those who could not flee, they've sacrificed an awful lot. The least we can do is remember who they are and make clear to their oppressors that we remember who these people are. So I hope, if nothing else, The committee is successful in keeping that alive. I thank you very, very much for your work doing it, because you're exactly right. There's a million causes, and unfortunately, a lot of bad things happening in a big, wide world. But this is one of those that really hits part of the heart for any of us that spent part of our lives watching Asia go from authoritarianism into just these economic booms and full of potential, and then to just didn't believe that the end of history was going to be a falsehood, and this process could reverse so soon in such a bad way. I really hope that folks listen and get involved. And in that spirit, Mark, you point people in the direction of where they can follow your commentary and your work and keep track of activities the committee is doing.
Sure. Well, thanks. So we're the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Our website is www.thecfhk.org. My Twitter is @MarkLClifford. And I've got a book coming out on Jimmy Lai later on this year. Hopefully we'll be talking about that. And just look for support anywhere we can find it, because the fact that a city that was as free and open as Hong Kong really, as I said, is pretty much as free and open, as freewheeling as a New York or a London, could be crushed so quickly and so thoroughly in defiance of all sorts of international promises, I really think should give us all a pause, whether you're in Taiwan or Manila or Seoul, or dare I say, New York or Washington or LA, because one of my colleagues has a $130,000 bounty on her head from the Hong Kong government, who says they're going to hunt her down like a street rat. They've detained her mother. I mean, there's a long arm of the Chinese and the Hong Kong law, I guess law in quotes here, that thinks that they should be able to determine what people all around the world say about Taiwan or the Dalai Lama or anything else. And I mean, I think Hong Kong is what happened in Hong Kong. It should be a real wake-up call to people everywhere.
Absolutely so. Well, I encourage our audience to check out our website, ChinaDeskPodcast.com. And if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing. Thank you all for joining, and a special thank you to Mark Clifford for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.